going to do something a little bit different over the next 5 weeks. We're going to take a look at some Bible studies that are inspired by current events. We'll be using the online curriculum from the Wired Word. So the current event this week comes with the recent announcement by the College Board concerning their AP World History course. They have decided that they're going to divide that course, which currently covers 100 centuries and 7 continents. They're going to divide that into everything from 1450 and forward and everything before that into a second course. Now, the controversial part of this is that only the part that is from 1450 and forward will qualify for the exam, which will qualify students to be able to get college credit. And the concern is, because of this, most schools will probably opt not to do the earlier portion and will just focus on the second course, since that's the only one that has an exam that will lead to college credit. Now, proponents say, this is a good thing because they can see in the essay portion of the test that students just don't have a depth of knowledge. It's just too much information for them to cover. There are, like in anything, there are also opponents of this move who would say things such as, by not covering anything before 1450 AD, you're going to miss out. It's going to become very Euro-centered, and it'll be mostly about Western civilization. There are also those who say it won't cover the influence and the origins of world histories, with the exception of maybe Mormonism. The College Board has agreed to go back and reconsider their decision and potentially this month come out with a revisions of how they'll plan to do this. So the big questions coming out of this are, number one, what is the purpose and role of studying history? And secondly, how does the study of history impact us today and into the future? Our lesson writers want us to consider, from a biblical standpoint, what the value of studying history, particularly as it relates to the Bible, and how that informs and enhances our faith. So that'll be our purpose for today, is to take a look at why is it important to have a historical perspective as it relates to our faith in understanding the Bible. We'll be taking a look at 4 scriptural texts today to help us in our understanding of this question. And the first one comes from Job. We'll be taking a look at the 8th chapter of Job, looking at verses 8 through 10. Listen to the words of the text. Put the question to our ancestors. Study what they learned from their ancestors. For we're newcomers at this, with a lot to learn, and not too long to learn it. So why not let the ancients teach you, tell you what's what, instruct you in what they knew from experience? Well, this seems like pretty good advice about the benefit of studying history and what our ancestors had to say. But the truth of the matter is, the context of this is Job has just lost his children tragically, and his friend, or supposed friend, Bildad, is basically giving him this information in an attempt to help him understand that it's his fault and that he is the cause of this calamity. Well, we have the value in reading Job of the whole story, and we know that this is not true. This was not because of something Job did. So this gives us our first lesson about history, and that is time helps us. In order to get perspective, we need to allow time to pass and then look back in order to determine the significance and the meaning of a particular event that might happen. It also helps inform us about the fallacies sometimes of trying to understand current events in the moment. You see, we need the perspective of the big picture. And so when it comes to our faith, understanding our faith from the perspective of the entire Bible gives us perspective that we could only get from looking at the entire history. Now, the next text comes from the 78th Psalm, verses 2 through 4. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. So here we have a reminder that one of the reasons that we take a look at the history and the entirety of Scripture is because by taking a look over time, we can see how God has provided for his people, how he's been faithful in his covenants. When we study the history of the Israelites, we are reassured that God will also provide for us if we will follow him. So one of the benefits of history is it can be encouraging to us. Our next text comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us on whom the ends of the ages have come. Here we have the Apostle Paul telling us another reason to consider history, and that is because it can instruct us or warn us or teach us or correct us. He's speaking here to the church in Corinth where there's a divisiveness that's going on. There are those in the congregation who feel that because they have become baptized and partaken in the Lord's Supper and have become followers of Christ, their wrongdoings had no impact on them. And to this, Paul makes the example of the children of Israel in the desert, in the wilderness, and he says, hey, they too had spiritual advantages as you do. And he said, he used the example of crossing the sea and passing through the cloud as an example of, he interprets that as the common day baptism. And he talks about the manna from heaven and the water from the rock and interprets that as communion. And the spiritual rock that followed them as Christ. And he said, hey, just like you, they had spiritual advantages. But listen, the Lord struck them down in the wilderness because of their sins. He talks about specifically idolatry, sexual immorality. And he's trying to make the point to the Corinthians that, hey, if God's people could be struck down and prevented from entering the promised land, what does that mean for you? And his point is he wants to correct them and have them come to an understanding and to live out their Christian faith in a way that would honor God and would be pleasing to him. And our final scripture text is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Another reminder to us about the value of history. Only when we look at our faith from the perspective of the entire Bible story are we able to be reminded and understand that really God created everything and he's in control of everything. This helps us keep things in perspective in our humanness and not to become too discouraged about things that we see that really cause us grief or sadness or hardship. We need to be reminded that God is in control of all of this and that he holds everything together. And therein lies where we put our faith. But it's impossible to understand that without having knowledge of the entire history of the Bible. Frank Ramirez, who's part of the staff at the Wired Word, had this interesting observation to say. He says, many Christians discount most of the Hebrew scriptures and start biblical history with the nativity set. Other than wanting to argue about how long creation took or if Jonah could survive 3 days in a whale, many Christians are woefully ignorant about the prophetic witness or the shape of Bible history or what the chronicler has to say in contrast to the author of Samuel and Kings. So what is Ramirez saying to us here? He's saying that often we just think about the New Testament or the more popular Bible stories, and only if we go deep and inform ourselves of the history will we strengthen our faith. A faith not based on the full story of God and creation and who God is and who we are. That is the key to being able to live out a productive faith. The Apostle Paul has this to say in 2 Timothy 3:16. All scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. Just this past week, the College Board did come out with a revised statement, and as a result of studying the question and the controversy, they've now decided to add another 250 years, taking the new course or the second course back to 1250. They feel like by doing that, that they can move beyond just kind of the Eurocentric Western civilization only. Of course, there's still many people who feel that there's too much being left out by only going back to 1200 instead of doing the entire world history. Well, you'll have to be the judge of how you feel about that. For you and I, however, the conclusion of today's lesson is that we should prayerfully consider what it is that God would have us learn through the history and study of the Bible that would help us better love Him, better have a relationship with Him, and also how to better serve and love our fellow man. Well, I hope you'll give some thought to some of these scripture texts this week and meditate on them and think about, your own approach to the Bible and why it's important to look at the Old Testament as well as the New Testament and to continue to be a student of the Bible. Our faith is based on our knowledge, our experience with, and the emotions that we get. Without informing ourselves through history and understanding the full story, we do ourselves and others a grave disservice. Well, till we get together next week and take a look at our next current event, I hope you have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time.